Now, Simon, you've been talking about Fire Emblem. You've been actually not talking about it. You've been playing some Fire Emblem Fates. You're covering that game for our site. What have you thought about it so far?
So there's for those of you who aren't familiar with Fire Emblem Fates, there's three versions. There's Conquest, Birthright, and Revelations. Conquest and Birthright are already out right now. Revelations is coming out next month, unless you have the special edition, in which case that's already on the cartridge. So I'm going through Conquest right now. I think Adam's gonna go through Birthright later, and I'll be doing Revelations also later. So, for my initial playthrough of it so far, I like it a lot. If this was the last Fire Emblem, I've sort of said this on our internal chat, but if this was the last Fire Emblem, I'd be totally happy with that. They do a lot of neat things, and it's sort of hard to think about how the series sort of improves from where it's currently at right now.
How much have you played of it so far?
So I've pretty much almost beaten Conquest, and I'm going through a hard playthrough of Conquest right now, just to see what it's like, because I heard like hard is really hard. So I wanted to go through that before starting Revelations.
Are you playing on
Yeah.
classic mode?
I'm playing on what?
You're playing on classic mode, right?
I'm playing on the mode where if people die, they die.
Yeah, classic.
That's classic
Yeah.
mode, which is
That's classic mode?
which is
Okay.
the best way to play, of course.
Yeah, I'm doing
Right.
a hard classic playthrough right now of Conquest as well. I just barely finished chapter 7, so I'm still early in, but I agree with Simon that there's a lot of interesting improvements that they've made in Fates.
Well, how do you? I mean, obviously, everyone here has played at least some Fire Emblem Awakening. What would you say is kind of the improvement so far that really stand out among everything else?
So one of the things that really stood out to me, and is I don't know if they changed the algorithm for how they did hit calculations. So there's always a hit rate of whether a percentage of this is a 99% chance to hit or something like that. And then I get the impression they changed the algorithm or calculations or something like that, because I've had a lot of hits that normally should have hit in previous games miss a lot. And a lot
Let me clarify. I know for a while what the calculation actually was. Like, if you had a 90% chance to hit, it would actually like roll twice and do an average, and if that average was within that 90% range, you hit. So what that meant was like a 90% chance is actually higher than that, if that makes sense. So you think they changed that?
I think they changed that. The reason why I say that is because I played XCOM. I jumped into Fates right after I finished XCOM, and right now the way it stands is I had a ton of units just straight up die because of it, and it's not fun.
That's very. So it's not fun.
I mean that's Fire Emblem. Sometimes
Yeah.
you get screwed by the RNG, and that happens. But
you-
sometimes
I've
it's on your side.
So it definitely happened. So that's one of the changes. A lot of people are gonna think that's a negative change. I actually think that's a beneficial change, because it really keeps you on your toes on like this decision. Even though it says like 90%, 92% hit rate, you might miss, and that might mean you have to restart the mission if you're playing on classic. If you really don't want to lose any units, and I've done that numerous times. From my experience with Conquest, I think it's a great game. It sort of goes back to the original Fire Emblem formula before Sacred Stones, where it's very linear. You don't have the open world to sort of farm and things like that. So it is a different play style. But I think the main thing that I really enjoyed about Fates is they actually redid sort of the weapon triangle. They redid how items work. They actually don't have usage, so they don't break after a certain amount of uses.
Oh, good.
I think the character variety is pretty neat. They added some new units, new combinations. The marriage system is back from Awakening, and children units are back. The children units aren't. I feel like they're sort of ham-fisted in the game. That's actually my least favorite part.
I think with Awakening they had the story and everything. Basically, the children units, it was all part of a cohesive whole. It made sense in the story and in the game. Where this time they had all those systems in place, so they brought the children back, even if it really didn't make any like in-game sense to why they're there. But
right,
whatever.
Also, they sort of expanded how the castle. They have a system called My Castle. They expanded what was the barracks system in Awakening, where you get to customize how your base sort of looks like, and each building you put in there makes it so you get better items for the next mission, upgrades your stats. There's a lot of neat ways to actually figure out how you're going to progress the game, because you can't build everything at once. Every single time you finish a mission, you get a certain point, and you can use that point towards building a new building that you unlock, or upgrading an existing building. So if you start off with like a staff building, like a building that sort of you can sell staffs, you can buy like heal or mending staffs, but you can't buy like iron swords or steel swords or anything like that, which means you're stuck with shitty weapons for the next for the foreseeable future until you have enough points to build that new armory. So it's pretty neat.
And I haven't played Conquest yet, but since there is no world map, you can't just, grind or fight battles to unlock more of the castle. You just have to pick and choose as you go.
Essentially, yep, that's exactly right. I do think because you can't farm up in the world, a lot of the characters are gonna they feel a lot more meaningful, right? So that means that you can't in Awakening, what you would do is you would just have children, and you would make make them super children, because you would do certain marriage combinations.
That's a really good
you would
term.
farm support points and things like that. And like you would eventually have like an Owen that's like has all these great skills and stats. Like, it was ridiculous. Here you can't necessarily do that.
In Awakening, because of the way skills passed down, I know the children were generally better than their parents, better units, because they could have, great combinations of skills. The parents just, you can't do anything with them, really, not too much. I mean, within the classes that they can go to.
Right.
Simon, I have a kind of a random question, but I was wondering, I know Awakening, at least on the hard mode, one of the more annoying things was whenever there was a reinforcement, they acted immediately. I think that was hard mode only. I think normal mode they wait a turn and then they act.
Yeah.
How are reinforcements in Conquest? Is it the same thing where they can just kind of show up out of nowhere and attack your healer or whatever?
So they removed that altogether. I think from what I understand, at least in the Japanese version, it did do that, where the reinforcements would show up on the enemy turn, so therefore they can also move. Here, the reinforcements will show up at your turn, or at the end of the turn in the beginning, so they can't move. And this will happen for normal and hard modes. So
that's good, because I know obviously sometimes you just get bad luck, but
I actually find that disappointing, because I always enjoyed that moment.
Well, it is kind of nice that sometimes you're caught off guard and you have to think quickly to defend yourself or counter or whatever. But sometimes you just especially if you're in a long level and then 25 minutes later a Pegasus Knight shows up and flies right through your guys and right to your healer and kills them. It's just a little bit annoying. So
I do think that so it's always easy to really expect where the reinforcements are going to come from. I think the map design sort of made it sort of obvious in the previous games. Here it's sort of even more obvious. Sort of piggybacking on the talking about the map design, I think the missions are pretty neat in Conquest. I know there was a lot of people saying how Conquest sort of harkened back to the original Fire Emblem Game Boy Advance Fire Emblem games, where there's a lot of different mission objectives. I actually don't really think there's that many mission objectives. There's always like that, seize this throne, or rout the enemy, or escape, or things like that. But in the end, like, you're ultimately, the best way to do it is just straight up killing the enemies. That's really gonna how you do it. So it doesn't really change anything. There was only really one mission where I approached the combat very differently. That's because the maps had certain abilities where you can change the terrain that would affect how you approach combat.
Well, I think even games like Radiant Dawn didn't have that many mission objectives. I mean, there were a couple that were defend this spot for so many turns or defend this area. But yeah, route the enemy or maybe get to a boss in a certain amount of time. So there were a couple. But one thing I'm more interested in is the map design itself, not the objective. I know Awakening had a lot of wide open maps where it's just kind of like an open field, and then you just kind of plow through the enemies.
Go anywhere.
Yeah, and so there was. I guess there's some strategy there, because you have to put your stronger units up front and your squishy units behind them. But it was kind of boring because I felt like 80% of the maps were that. How are the maps in Conquest?
The maps in Conquest are pretty much the same along the lines of Awakening, with the exception of there's a lot more what's it called? There's a lot more frequency in fights happening within a confined space, like so within like a castle or a building. So therefore, you have to move through corridors, sort of like the Blazing Sword from Game Boy Advance. But there are certain points in the map where you can actually change the terrain or have an environmental effect pop up to put you at an advantage. That's through a mechanic called Dragon Vein, which is I think really neat. Only royal, members of the royal family can move to this spot and use the Dragon Vein, and sometimes it'll rain acid, so it'll drop every enemy to 1 HP, which is neat. Sometimes it'll blow enemy towards you, so you don't have to move all your units to the enemy to kill them. Sometimes it prevents disaster. It's really neat, and I think it sort of changes how you actually approach certain missions, or maybe create certain bottlenecks so you don't get overrun at all sides. I think that's one of the most neat mechanics in the game.
Yeah, that sounds cool because it's a little bit different from just my stats versus yours. Like a lot of like the GBA games are.
Sure.
So I
How do
think
you,
that's.
sorry.
No, I just think it's kind of neat how sometimes you have to use like unique map elements for certain levels, and if you use them well, you can make it that much easier on yourself.
Right,
So.
and not everyone can use the Dragon Vein, right? Only certain only members of the royal family are gonna be able to do it. So that's, I guess, if you want to really think about it, you can have children's married up with the royals, or you can have children's who have royal blood, so everyone can use Dragon Vein. I don't know, but
How do you
that's
feel about the story so far compared to like the other Fire Emblem games? Is it pretty good, or are you kind of mixed on it, or how do you feeling about it right now?
so. I think the characters are really neat. I think it's really unfortunate that the characters are in a really shitty story. Like,
Oh,
frankly speaking, like, Xander is like this very noble person who wants to do things for his kingdom, but knows that the world is not necessarily black and white, and treats his siblings in a very great lordly fashion without necessarily looking down on them. There's the other siblings like Leo, who's a caster, who's sort of mischievous in ways. He's just a little tricky. He finds loopholes and things like that. The annoying one is probably Elise, the youngest sibling, who just does the usual like Japanese tropey Oni-chan thing all the time, which is
oh,
obnoxious.
Big brother, big brother.
Yeah,
Big
big
brother.
brother thing. And there's another one of those in Birthright too. So fuck my life. But I
Now,
do.
very negative against
I
it.
do
I
think
haven't,
these
I
characters
haven't.
are interesting though. Like they have a great character dynamic. There's no growth. So I think one of the problems in the newer Fire Emblems is that all these characters, they actually don't go through any growth. They're the same
Well,
characters from the beginning to the end.
Well, I
Straight up.
mean, like if we're talking about characters and like the Fire Emblem games for Game Boy Advance, you kind of have your Lord units, and they're in every scene, and then there's a couple of other units that are important, like Ninian in Fire Emblem 7, but the rest of the units you get them in a level, and then you never hear from them again unless you're talking about supports.
Yep.
So I don't think that's totally unusual.
I don't. Well, it's
I
not
think
that it's unusual. It's just it's not the extra characters that I'm necessarily concerned about. It's the primary characters. So
I know, like, I think in terms of characters, the Teleus games, Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn, they had a larger percentage of the cast be more like involved and significant in the plot, and I think they did a little bit better job at that. But those two games are kind of the only ones that do. The rest of them, all the characterization is basically in support conversations. Some of them
yeah.
good, some of them bad.
So, what I would like to know is that obviously there's a lot of controversy around the localization. How do you
Right.
feel about that so far? Has it really gotten in the way of your enjoyment from the story? I mean, obviously, putting aside your feelings on how the character growth is managed in that game, how do you feel about the actual like the translation for it as well?
So, I mean, this is gonna sound really like a cop-out answer, but it really depends. So,
Oh,
a lot of the
okay.
enjoyment is gonna be derived from your exposure to how much of the game has changed and how much you care about the change. So,
I totally
I
agree
was
with
not
that.
aware of the changes beforehand. I knew some of it, but not too much of it. It hasn't necessarily changed my enjoyment of the game. I still think within the context of the English localization, it's a great localization. It does a lot of neat things.
Oh, good.
But I do think that sometimes there has to be some consolations that have to be made when localizing things, and I can see why they made some of the changes that were brought up. Like, I think one of them that was brought up was conversation between two characters, and they were talking about kill counts, like their murder counts, in so their war record, I guess, and that's a pretty mature topic. So I can see how like that would put contribute to a possible M rating. So if like from a business decision, I respect that, but at the same time, like it doesn't like just because it's necessarily different from what it was in the Japanese doesn't mean that it's gonna take away your enjoyment of the game. As long as it's still within the confines of the game itself, it's still great. Like that doesn't change anything. It's when you pull in outside factors that changes things. I was found that to be an extremely unreasonable argument from the masses.
Yeah, let me comment about something. First of all, that change you mentioned is honestly probably, I think, the most questionable one that I've heard of, where they basically replaced the support conversation with a series of ellipses where it's just they basically stare
It's
at
only
each other.
ellipses.
It's just verbal, like
Well,
a non-verbal.
Yeah, they
understanding.
like they stare at each other and then that's it. So like they
Okay.
totally remove the conversation. Like I think there'd be a way to write around it if it was a content issue in terms of they're talking about murders or whatever and they thought maybe it was too detailed or whatever. You'd think there'd be a way to write around it in some way rather than just remove it completely in a sort of a joke. But it is only just like one support conversation out of like hundreds, so
Right.
it doesn't like
it doesn't
ruin
make
the
sense.
game. Actually, I learned about this not too long ago. One of the support conversations in Fire Emblem 8, I believe, between Dazla and Gilliam. In Japan, they're talking about like drinking and how much they can hold, or and how they don't get drunk. It's like a drinking game type support, and they changed it in the U.S. release. I don't even remember what they changed it to. And I played the game, I enjoyed the game, and I never knew. And it's like sometimes there's these things that are changed, and sometimes they're kind of weird.
Yeah.
But
It always depends. That's the most important thing. It always depends because there's always
Yeah.
like the ones that we can raise questions about, especially nowadays. You can have plenty of examples of like games where this change has been made, and I'm never going to use this word censorship because I think that's just a cop-out answer to say, I mean, or at least that's like a non-argument that you can bring up something and say it's censorship. But those
Definitely not
changes that are
censorship.
made, it's common, like I think that the thing to point out is that there's never been a very straightforward Fire Emblem game so far. Like there's been some I think there was like an article I read not too long ago where someone mentioned how many different changes are made to Fire Emblem, such as like points where certain characters were like extremely depressing or very moody or very angry or very upset, and they made some slight changes.
They made
and
'em-
they
they
became
made 'em-
beloved in the West, and so people don't know what their origin story really was or what it used to be. And then there's like some design decisions that should have been left on the cutting room floor, but they instead implemented them anyway, and so they made some changes in the localization. And I think it's because obviously with the growth of social media, it's become more of a thing to argue about, or at least it's meaning that the smaller masses have a much larger voice. But I can definitely see their point, and I respect people who are willing to point out their misgivings on a certain topic. But as you mentioned before, there's certain small like these social talks that they have, like kill counts and drinking and stuff like that, that some slight adjustments are good. But yeah, I do agree that there's also some cases where it's like, you really didn't need to make too many changes to that. You
And,
totally
like-
could have still put that in within the context of a war game where it's like, yeah, these things are kind of talked about. Like in Lord of the Rings, these kind of conversations do come up. So why is it that this has to be edited?
and also
this is
like
the question.
the Soleil conversation, that's the one in Japan. They have like a magic potion.
Yeah.
Oh, it's not
They-
a magic potion.
they
They totally
basic-
spike their drinks.
Basically,
Yeah.
well, no, the trait, Soleil's trait is still there. They just kind of removed that. I guess you can call it. I saw someone refer to it as a landmine. They removed that landmine from the conversation, and it makes it a little bit more of a boring conversation. Like, oh, I love you anyways because even though you're a man, but even though I am like smitten with girls usually, so it kind of makes it a little bit more boring. But they removed that landmine in the localization, which is probably the best thing to do.
Yeah, I don't think I
about
see
that
many
scene,
arguments
about
for
that
that.
scene
Yeah.
in particular, I actually think that is so. I know in the Japanese version, Soleil is given the impression she's totally lesbian. In the English version, if you actually start reading, if you start paying attention to what she says and things like that, you immediately get the I was snapping, by the way. You immediately get the hint that she's actually not lesbian in the English localization. She's totally bisexual.
Well,
So
and
Which
I
is
should,
fine.
I feel like I should mention that Nintendo is not against lesbian characters. What's her name? The Rogue in Radiant Dawn. I forget her name. Like she's like clearly and obviously a lesbian girl. I forget her name. So it's yeah, I don't think that was the issue. It's just kind of this weird
well, I'm
drugging
just saying,
thing.
like they changed. I
Well,
think
yeah,
like
they might tweak the
it still
dialogue.
makes sense. So like a lot of the changes, they
Heather,
make
yes,
sense.
Heather.
Then a lot of the changes that they made, I still think it makes sense. It's very consistent throughout the game. So there's not a sudden disconnect at all. So like the support conversation that was removed between Saizo and Baraka, like they're not very flaunty. They're not characters who flaunt their shit. They don't talk necessarily much. Um, they're assassins. They know what their job is.
Straight and
So
to the
like
point.
so like a lot of the things a lot of the changes that they made, yeah, they're very drastic changes, but it's also consistent within like the characters like dialogue and like how they actually react in situations. So like for Soleil to remove that landmine, like it still makes sense within the confines of who Soleil's character is. So that's fine. Like so I'm just saying like I understand why people get upset that these changes exist, but it would be one thing if they made these changes and they didn't necessarily it's like digging up a hole and then refilling it with like something else so like it doesn't look it's still sort of level a level ground. That's what they sort of did. They replaced it with something else, but it's still fine. Like it still
And
makes sense.
And I know I saw, when this was coming out, I saw like there was a conversation with one of the Dragon Girls, and she goes like, "Rar rar, that means I love you,"
That was cute. Yeah.
and
Oh
like
god.
the original dialogue is just like, "I'm happy and we can be together. I'm so happy," and it's just like, sure they changed it, but it means it's not. It doesn't mean anything different, and it just kind of plays on like the
The
goofy,
intent
cute
is there.
Yeah, just
personality.
roll
The
your eyes and
intent
move
that I
on,
love
kind
you
of
is
thing.
the intent that I care about you a lot and I love you is and that childish innocence, it's still there. So like
Yeah, I think it's. I mean, I think the one thing you can
Well,
take away from all of that is that I think it's important to raise some of these issues because, as we mentioned, there are cases where it's like you didn't really need to make those changes. We could have easily gotten on with it. I think it's like understanding where people stand in the West, like what they understand and what they like can handle, especially when it comes to things such as sexual content and violence and things like that. That I think that once we move on from that, Nintendo understands more about what people care about and what they can appreciate and what they can handle. I think that's going to do better for them in the long run because there's been like this kind of weird retraction of having like it's kind of like back in the 90s where Nintendo didn't really think that they didn't really want these M-rated games on their console. And so like if it means having a game like Fire Emblem Fates having like an M rating, I think would have been far more interesting, and I think that we need more games like that now, ones that handle far more mature topics. So it's like I wonder what an M-rated Fire Emblem looks like.
I think from a creative perspective that's fine, but we have to understand like despite how well Fire Emblem sold, Fire Emblem is still a niche series. It wants to have wide appeal and it wants to make it return. Nintendo is still business. They want to make the money that as much money as possible from this localization, and having that M rating would lock out a lot of people that would
You
have
see,
probably.
that's the thing is that people make that argument, but some of the
It
best
is.
like selling games ever are rated M, like such
You
as
have to
GTA and
understand, for
Skyrim.
AAA games, the M rated it doesn't matter, but for niche series, an M rating definitely matters
Well,
I
because
think Fire
I
Emblem's
th
growing
I
from that
think I
though.
think Fire Emblem they're trying to sell it to like kids and teenagers in addition to us. So there it's that and I'm not saying that's how it should be. I'm just saying that's how Nintendo is trying to
Yeah,
sell it
parents
now.
still buy
yeah.
their kids M-rated games anyway. As
Yeah.
long as it's like if it's just like breaching to the M, like it's rated teen, but it's getting close to that edge. I think that's a totally different thing than straight up like full on M rated game.
Let
But
me comment on two things. First of
yeah,
all, just going slightly back what we were talking about like dialogue changes. I think it's I think there's definitely a fine line, maybe not quite a fine line, but the any sort of localization change should be, faithful to the original, of course. But I do think they don't have to be so faithful that they can't, put their own personality into it sometimes and maybe try to, have the characters, and maybe showcase their personality a little bit more with certain diction or the way that their sentences are phrased and things like that.
The original intent should be there still. Is
Well,
what you're
like just sorry, kind of a tangent here. I was playing Gaijinworks Summon Night 5 not too long ago, and that's Victor Ireland, who's from Working Designs, who's done a bunch of stuff way back in the day.
Lunar,
Yeah,
among other games.
and I know there's some weird
Explore.
reference. Like I think when you have references in dialogue, that gets a little weird. But in Summon Night 5, there was a lot of colorful dialogue, a lot of playful words and some wordplay, and a lot of ways in which characters phrase their sentences, and it was really flowery at times, but it worked really well. Like each character had really distinct and obvious personalities, but it wasn't like cliche. Now, I don't know what it was in Japanese, but I have a feeling it wasn't quite like that. But I don't think that was a bad thing. That they kind of spruced up the dialogue and made it really colorful at times.
See, it's
Yeah.
unless you've grown up with those games, I don't think people really appreciate it nowadays. I still get a big kick out of like when Vic Ireland and Gaijin Works and all that, when they have a lot of fun with the localization and not make it 100% authentic. It's like this anime Ghost Trick where they just had not Ghost Trick but was it Ghost Detective? Well, they just had a lot of fun with the script, and so it's like you can't do that now because people take it way too seriously, and I think that's
Well,
Yeah,
I mean, so it
same
should-
thing happens in Project Cross Zone too, right? Because
totally.
because one of the main characters, Xiaomu, she's always been known in the West as like this big nerd, and even in Japan she's like a nerd, but she's more interested like in puns in Japan, while in the West she does a lot of video game references. Like there's like I can guarantee you that Carmen Sandiego reference in Project Cross Zone 2 wasn't in Japan, but does that really shatter her character? Does it really break her character? And, for some people it is, some people it doesn't, because like there's always going to be this conversation about localization versus like a one-to-one translation. People always going to want something super authentic because that's how it was released in over in Japan, so that's why how it should be released here. So it's like kind of like mirroring what was like in the original release, like like the true quote unquote spirit of it.
Yeah.
And so
I was
and
Ghost Stories, by
I
the way.
Yeah,
think
so-
there's always that case for translations versus localization, right? Like that one-on-one translation versus changing it. And I think
I don't think I ever want a one-to-one
There's-
translation ever.
Have you seen the
there's always
one-to-one
gonna- so
translations
there's
for like
always gonna
Chrono
be
Trigger?
people who-
They're
there's
mess.
always-
It's
there's
not
always
good.
people
It's
who
not
either
very
really
good.
hate it or people who really like it. There's always going to be that split regardless. If a company, if Fire Emblem, if they changed Fire Emblem Fates before the release, where the translation was a more faithful translation of the original Japanese, there would be people bitching about how this certain phrase makes no fucking sense at all. Like this is only makes sense within the culture, context of Japanese culture, and yada yada yada. And then if we did the exact opposite, we would run into the issue of, well, this is supposed to be this way in Japanese because yada yada yada. So there's always going to be people on the other side of the coin. That being said, like we live in America, so I can understand and I respect the company saying, hey, this is towards an American audience. So therefore, if we change the dialogue so it fits within the context of the American culture, that's not the end of the world. Like
I know some people who have said like when you're speaking in English and you're speaking to people you oftentimes don't refer to them by name or brother or family or whatever. So like if you're talking to your brother, you don't go brother. You don't call him that in English.
You don't do that? I do that.
Yeah, hey brother.
Unless you're like trying to get their
that's not really
attention.
work out.
But like, so I have heard some people in like Fire Emblem Fates saying it is kind of weird how everyone is calling you Big Brother, and like that's like your name, even though in English that almost doesn't sound right either because you don't call your brother every time you speak to them. It's
Bro.
But-
how do you guys
but
feel
that-
about what Atlas USA does, like in Persona 3 and 4? They just do the honorifics just straight up in there, mixed with the English dialogue.
So I think they
It's
do
kinda
that
nice.
because not for cultural reasons. I don't think they do that for American cultural reasons. I think they use those because it's set in Japan, so therefore they keep those in there to make it consistent.
That's
yeah,
very true.
that it's a
because
little
they do
different than
that
just
with
a
the rest.
fantasy.
Yeah,
Anyways,
that's
the other thing I was going to mention, before I talked about localization changes, I do think it's a little weird that apparently Zach was talking about mature content, but they took out the swimsuits, and that's just kind of like, did they really have to take out the swimsuits?
Yeah,
I
that
mean,
was weird. Too.
like every
So-
JRPG in the last 10 years or more has had like bath costumes or beach
the Tales
costumes.
series, they've got
I
the
just-
swimsuit DLC.
And that's for a long time ago. Like even like Tales of Symphonia had that, or Tales of the Abyss. Like we're talking a decade plus ago, and all those games are rated teen. So I don't really It's just kind of
Dude,
it's
they
like
talk
yeah,
about
it doesn't-
freaking Tears' melons, like in one of the what's it called, skits in Tales of the Abyss. So like,
I don't get
so
that.
you're right. I think you bring up a very valid point,
like
Adam. But
it's, and also like they got rid of like the chest slider for women in Xenoblade Chronicles,
oh yeah,
and it's like every
X.
character creator has a
a
chest
bust
or a boob
sizer.
slider. Yeah, and it's
Yeah,
just
it's like you're making fun of girls who have larger chests at that
and
point. It's
and
like,
like
come on.
I remember playing a Sims game, like I think it was The Sims 2 on PS2 back in 2003 or whatever, and they had a chest slider and it was rated teen, and like so it just things like that Nintendo does. It's just kind of like
So
okay.
And it's
I
on their
agree with your
consoles too.
I mean,
perspective.
I don't think it like ruins the game or anything, but it's just kind of a big question mark. Like,
Yeah,
okay,
like to
that
what
was
degree?
weird.
Because like Nintendo is on this weird like kind of spree of like omitting content or changing up content for their Western releases. Like I know like the earliest, most recent one that I can think of is like the Fatal Frame on the Wii U. You know, they got rid of like like those lingerie revealing outfits and like replaced it like the Zero Suit Samus and I think another character. And like it's just it's
When was
odd
the-
because like why like
Are
when you're
those
talking
games
about the
rated
target
M anyway?
audience.
Are those
I
games
think they're
rated
rated M. Yeah, I think Fatal
Yeah,
Frame is
so-
rated M.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's because it's obviously like a horror
Right.
game. But like,
Yeah.
like when was the last time a Western RPG was on a Nintendo console? Because I'm trying to think. Like, I
Mass
don't
Effect,
remember
3.
since like maybe.
Deus Ex is on Wii U.
Mass
That's
Effect
true.
3 is on Wii U.
Was it? Oh yeah, that's right.
So-
That's right,
Oh.
launch title.
So
Right
I
on
understand wherever
It's
all of
upgraded.
y'all are coming from, but at the same time, like I think and it's just me playing devil's advocate. I think from where Nintendo's coming from is if they think there's a hint that it'll contribute to an M rating, they just straight up to removed it. I
Well,
think that's what I think that's the mindset. And like,
don't get me wrong. None of these changes like ruin the game for me. I'm not going
No,
to
they
go
do
out
not.
there and boycott the game or whatever. But I do think it's like I know some people. It seems like if they change anything, they're like, I'm not supporting Nintendo, and just like, well, I don't care about it that much. I'll still
Yeah.
enjoy
like,
the
do you
98%
really
of the
need
game
face
that's
rubbing?
there.
Like, really, do
Yeah.
you really need face rubbing?
But
Like at the same time, like
it's still worth questioning. Like, okay,
But
you
for
know,
some
Totally,
people
no,
that- for
that's
some
the thing.
people it
It's
is,
like the
yeah.
logic's there. It's like
Nintendo's
when
like-
you. Sorry.
Nintendo's like the overly protective parent. They sort of decide what's sort of gonna be the best for us and just start removing shit because they think that's like, oh, it's too much. We can't give you a boob slider because everyone's just these are all 13-year-old raging hormone ass like kids who are gonna just make their boobs like fucking huge in Xenoblade Chronicles.
I think like
Like,
with
that's what
every
they're gonna
movement
do.
that you can talk
Just,
about, there's
like-
always some points that you can point out and say, okay, well you've got a good point there. Like some of the things you're talking about make a lot of sense when it comes to people upset about localizations or like upset about journalists or anything like that. Like, oh yeah, I see that. You've got some points there. It's just that you get some people also mixed in with that movement who are kind of extremists who take it way too far.
There's
So
a
it's
discussion
important
to be
time
there's
like reel it back a little bit.
yeah, there's a discussion
Yeah,
to be
it's-
had, but there's some people who are just obnoxious and
Yeah, you
they
get that.
make it they just
Unreasonable.
drown out the people that are actually trying to hold a conversation, and it's
Yeah, I
just
think that's great. I want to talk more to the people that want to have that conversation because I think it's important.
Definitely.
The translation versus localization. You'll always hear about people who actually do the work that say, no, we can't do that literal translation because there's a lot of words that don't exist in the English language, so you can't do that.
I
But also it's like the
I see
decision's made.
I see localizers make fun sometimes how like Japanese uh just Japanese sentence structure in general they repeat themselves more than
Yes, and or use
than English
ellipses
do.
to convey emotion. You're like, no, you can't do
And
that.
and so if you just translate it, you end up getting characters just repeating themselves. I forget what it was, but one visual novel, like the phrase "it cannot be helped" was said like more than 100 times or something. And
Oh, I know this.
Oh,
and
my
in the
God.
visual
Wait,
novel,
sounds really familiar.
Yeah.
I just saw it on
Yeah.
Twitter, so I don't know what it is. So it's like stuff like that. It's like, okay, if you want to pull out a thesaurus or use your own imagination to try to get people to, change up their wording sometimes to make things flow better.
Well,
yes,
it's also-
that's,
I think
yes,
I
that's
think it's a
changing
Japanese
the.
title. I think it's a
Certain
Trails
Japanese
title.
phrases also just they're used like they have certain Japanese phrases have like a lot more meanings than it would in American language. Like for us, like we distinguish like we have certain phrases that mean multiple things, but at the same time, like our language is very large, allows for various phrasing structures for various different intents. Whereas Japanese, like they have this set phrase that's that's been adapted throughout the years, decades, and centuries to mean multiple things that wouldn't
Yeah.
necessarily translate over properly if we did it.
kind of reminds me of the very end of Final Fantasy X, where Yuna says "arigato" in Japanese, but they changed it to "I love you" in English, and that some people are like, "No, you
Yeah.
changed it, you ruined the scene," and it's just like, "Oh, come on."
It's
Yeah.
like, yeah, it's that's a very important
Like
At
point.
this
it,
point,
it
we're
goes
kind
back to
of
the intent, right? Like, what is the intent of like Eunice saying that, right? I mean, does changing it to "I love you" really change the intent? Probably not.
I mean, they had a big scene together, so it's not like it's beyond people to understand what's happening. But
Right?
Yeah, I
think
think
that's
at this
important.
point that like we're kind of like just like splitting hairs at this point. It's like we understand that like like English and Japanese are very different languages. And I think for me personally, like the bottom line is like just moving forward, it's okay to like acknowledge these changes, point them out, spread the word, but don't be like a huge douchebag about it.
Well,
Don't
there's
like
there.
you get like you gotta like there's an easy not easy, but there's a more informative, mature way to convey like like this
I
sort of
I
like
I actually,
localization type
I
of
actually
side. And
Yeah, you're
yeah,
exactly right. I actually don't remember what the website is, but I see it linked on Twitter here and there. There's some fan who actually will basically say, in a polite, not biased way, like, "All right, so here's what the Japanese says, and here's what the English translation is, and let's talk about the differences."
yeah,
I remember reading that for like
uh,
I'm bringing up a bunch of different examples here, but in the Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker, Ganondorf's final speech, it's kind of spruced up in English, and he actually says quite a few more words.
mhm.
And I remember there was a post talking about how that's different than in Japanese, where it's kind of more straightforward. But yeah, it just I do think now that, especially in today's day and age, where we can easily make those comparisons, we should make those comparisons, but we shouldn't go crazy if things change here and there a
The
little.
internet is a forum where it takes everything to the most hyperbolic degree. Like that's just the nature of the internet. Like
Yeah.
I'm guilty of this too. Like on Gap, I'll post like
You
You don't
definitely are.
say. You
like
don't say.
just listen to my previous podcast. Like the most hyperbolic shit you can ever fucking think of. The most like fuck. It's so bad. Anyway, but that being said, like people use extremities to describe how they feel. I guarantee you, if you really think about it, there are actually very few people who actually think how they think and feel the exact way they actually are saying it on the internet. So, like, I understand, like, also the perspective, playing devil's advocate again. Like I understand the idea of expressing it in your displeasure or pleasure of something to the most, to the
Umpteenth
utmost
degree.
extreme.
I think it's important just to point out that sometimes these localizers have to behold to Nintendo's like the suits in the room saying like, no, you can't. You have to edit this
Yeah.
out. You have to change this. Who have to answer to stock
Yeah,
orders.
Which might be
so-
a rating
goes up.
reason, right?
Yeah,
Which
so,
might be a
like,
rating reason.
I know Nitch Maragos, who used to work at, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, but he used to work at Atlas and now he's at Nintendo. He said that he was working on Fates, and then he starts getting bombarded with all these people like harassing him and saying he ruined it and all that, when some of these changes he didn't probably have creative control over.
No, they don't.
So,
Novas don't have
I
any
mean,
creative control.
well, I
Unless it's
mean,
just a
they
small
have
team. That's
they have some control over like what wording and phrasing they use, but like in terms of like the swimsuits being cut out, like you're clawing at the wrong guy.
yeah,
Uh,
that's
and
fair.
also it just in kind of what Kaios or Simon was saying,
Yes. Gonna use his handle.
that's his handle, is that like we on our RPG site we tweeted like uh Nintendo announced that they sold 300,000 copies, and then we're all of a sudden some people are like, all those people should be ashamed. It's
Oh
like,
yeah,
come on.
people really went off on that. There was like a long conversation in our Twitter account of people just talking back and forth, fighting over it. It's like 300,000 people that are
If-
probably going to
if-
return
if-
all their
if-
copies. I'm
Why
like,
should
come on,
Nintendo
guys,
be?
can't
Why
you
should
just?
Nintendo be ashamed of selling a product it'd be one thing if sold a really shitty product, right? Like they
Yeah.
sold like a Corvette made with like Toyota parts on the inside, like Toyota Camry parts.
Really
Like,
nailed them on that.
but like it'd be one thing if they did that, but that's not what they did. They created a rock solid product that's better than Awakening. It deserves to have. I would be legitimately sad if it actually sold less than 300,000.
Well,
Like,
yeah, considering it's two versions, that kind of dilutes that number a little bit. Like, of course, it's going to sell more than Awakening, which had one
Right.
version. But
Yeah,
I just
but
think I just
at the same
think if
time.
you're upset, like if you're actually legitimately not just puzzled, but actually upset at some of the changes you see in the English version, the silliest thing to do is to like, you know, to insult people who did buy the game and who are surprised, maybe even enjoying it. That's just petty.
That's
Anyways,
the thing
I wish
is that don't attack the game. Don't attack the people that like it. But let's go ahead and just kind of wrap things up on Fire Emblem Fates. And so, Simon, how many hours have you put into that game so far?
Do you really want to know?
No.
A lot.
I'll ask.
Yeah, let's do it.
That's
It's
true.
a really disgusting amount.
That's good.
Okay.
Then
What's the
it kinda
disgusting
goes to
amount?
show.
I would
Yeah.
say it's about like 35 hours right now.
Oh, that's
Disgusting. Filthy.
Ugly.
Disgusting.
Okay,
Filthy.
you have to understand, like, it's 35 hours. Oh wait,
that's game.
Yeah,
Well, that's game clock. That doesn't count all the time you got to
Yeah.
restart
yeah, that's
levels,
count all
right?
the deaths, and I've been playing
What's the
since
real
last
number?
week, so yeah, you can just imagine, like,
50
that,
plus
considering
around.
between work and life, like, yep, that's a lot.
That's a long time. Yeah. So when do you expect to have your review up?
I expect to have my review up sometime probably next week or the week after. I want to make sure I'm very thorough with it.
Sure,
Since the game's already released anyway, I'm gonna put a little spin on it. Talking a little about some of the changes that Bates has made compared to its predecessors. And then I'll have Revelations out. I'll also make the review for Revelations probably a little bit different as a culmination between Birthright and Conquest and sort of like how it compares. And then Adam will have Birthright up.
It might be a little later. I'm kind of on a couple of other things. I'll probably be getting Zelda soon.
Heard it
so.
here first.
Yeah. So for the most part, it seems like our view is going to be mostly focused on Conquest, but we all look forward to the review. I'm actually very much interested just because I haven't really put much time into that series, but Awakening was a great game, so I'm excited to see what Fates is like, and then we can move on to see the Wii U Fire Emblem game that I'm most excited about.
Yanabe and Roku.
Yes.
That's gonna have some
excited.
that's gonna have some interesting
yeah, that's gonna be
conversations.
interesting.
Torres RPG time. Let's do
I'm
it.
so ready. Like
All
this
right.
is the height of the Fire Emblem franchise. This is where we've all been heading towards. Awakening, Fates, they've been all moving towards this direction. Thank you for giving us waifus.
No, let's
That was
not talk about
sarcasm.
that. Don't use that term.
All
Never
sarcasm.
use that term ever again.
That's a bad term in this podcast.
Thanks a lot,
Get
Simon,
outta
for
here.
talking to us about Fire Emblem Fates.